We are back, ladies and gentlemen. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Our next guest, ladies and gentlemen, is one of my favorite guests and one of my, frankly, one of my favorite authors and one of my favorite reporters, ladies and gentlemen. He is the author of multiple bestsellers, The Brotherhoods, Octopus, his latest Arms and the Dudes, about three Orthodox Jewish stoners who pulled off one of the biggest small arms deals in the history of this country. He is writing for a Rolling Stone, but now we're talking about a piece he wrote for the New York Times on the a profile, the first, if I am not mistaken, print interview with Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Guy Lawson. Welcome, Guy.
Hey, Sam, if I can just make a couple of points here. One is Arms and the Dudes makes an excellent Christmas gift for those of you thinking of that.
No, honestly, I'm not. That's absolutely true. The stories you find are always really, in some ways, just completely insane.
Well, the second thing I want to say is that I've spent really a good part of my career criticizing, often ridiculing, and sometimes correcting the New York Times. So it's an unusual thing for me to be writing for them, but there you are.
There was a little bit of back and forth on from the Arms and the Dudes, right? Because they had written a piece about these guys back in the day, and through your reporting, you found that their piece was
categorically wrong.
Oh, all right. I was going to say bunk, but I mean yours is a little bit more, I guess, on point. And so good for them. Well, I mean, they at least you know. Good for them for not being well. I mean, they may have been pissy about it, but at least they didn't hold a grudge.
Right, and there was some de-gonzoing of the piece. I will say, the Trudeau process. But I was down with it. The substance stayed the same. It just they've got a much broader audience. They're not to a demographic, and I think it was important to introduce the leader of Canada at a crucial moment, not just in Canadian history but in global history. The election in Canada has a lot of the resonance with the American election and the rhetoric surrounding the Muslim population of the world and what Canadians chose to do. So we can talk about that if you'd like.
Yeah, I want to do that. And I want to say that, after the recent Canadian elections, I got multiple emails from people saying you should have Guy Lawson on to explain because you don't know anything about Canadian politics.
That was from my wife and kids, right?
Yes, they all wrote me, but your kids are really, they are incredibly foul-mouthed when they write into a show, but they are also very great with grammar. And what I didn't know was that now, do I have this right? Your dad was a spokesperson for the NDP?
I am so Canadian, and it feels like Canada just doesn't have any kind of recognition of that for me. Like, I'm not expecting, the Canadian press to bow down to me or anything, but I am so Canadian. My father was very involved in politics. He was actually Australian, but he moved to Canada when I was born, and he got involved he was a journalist, and then he got involved in politics, the NDP, and he was the press attaché or spokesperson, I guess you'd say, for a guy named Tommy Douglas, who was the leader of the NDP in the 1968 federal election that was won by Pierre Trudeau. That was the year that Trudeau mania swept the country, and my old man was, Tommy Douglas. The two most beloved figures in Canadian history are really Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Tommy Douglas. And my father was very close to Tommy Douglas, and it was a horrific experience campaigning against Pierre Trudeau because he was, number one, he was an expert thief. He would steal policies and ideas and turn them into his own, and that was just infuriating to my father. And, number two, he was, the establishment, and my father was very much anti-establishment and trying to, create a much broader social progressive agenda than the Liberals ever would. So, my dad told me stories when I was a kid about this campaign and how miserable it was. Days and weeks would pass, and he and Douglas would not even exchange a word. I mean, it was just absolutely devastatingly bad. And then, the son, Pierre Trudeau's son, Justin, is no match for his father in terms of accomplishments or intellectual kind of abilities or anything like that, but he's a hell of a politician. So in that sense, I was really drawn to the story from a personal connection.
Well, all right, let's talk about that, and then let's broaden out the conversation because I have to say, I mean, he came across in your piece as an eminently likable guy, as
very Canadian, right?
yeah, and also, I mean, I didn't really have a sense of just, I mean, he's pretty green. In one way, he's incredibly green. And it seems, from your piece that he basically became the reason why he is prime minister today is because he won a charity boxing match on some level. But of course, he also had some amazing experiences as a kid. Give us a sense of like this, because my understanding is that what happened is he and the Liberals ran on an anti-austerity platform. The New Democrats sort of ran, in some respects, tried to run slightly to the right of where they are normally, and that ended up hurting them. But that there was like a coalescing against trying to end the Harper, I guess, regime, experiment, project, whatever they thought they were doing. So just characterize this for us and give us a sense of what of who Justin Trudeau is.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to think about it, as you're talking, reminds me of another Canadian, Joni Mitchell, who had the lyric, "Don't it always seem to go? You don't know what you've got till it's gone." And what was happening in Canada was that the sense of being Canadian was evaporating, and the idea that Canada would have its unique perspective on not just domestic but also world events was being swept away by this conservative point of view, which was much more reflexively pro-American, pro-war, disrespectful of minorities. We wouldn't even call them minorities in the Canadian context really anymore, but of otherness, and was seeing sort of the Muslim community writ large, but most specifically refugee and immigrant communities, as a threat rather than as a humanitarian crisis, especially in Syria. It became, the election in Canada took on this really deep, profound meanings. And so what you had in the last few elections was around 2/3 of Canadians would vote for a liberal-minded party, either the Liberals or the NDP, and the Conservatives would win, first a minority, then a majority, with about 1/3 of the country. So you had more or less a 2/3 progressive vote divided. And in this campaign, when the stakes kept getting higher and higher, and the rhetoric more and more hysterical and fear-mongering from the Conservative Party, you had the NDP, poor old NDP, my dad would just roll his eyes in misery at this, but the NDP, foolishly, in hindsight, trying to show that it could wear big boy pants and be fiscally responsible and therefore, be trusted with government, coming in with essentially an austerity budget along conservative lines. And you had Trudeau, who was very aware of this opportunity, tacking to the left and saying, no, we don't need to be austere. We can spend on social programs and infrastructure. And so you can have your cake and eat it too. And in the sort of sense of, I called it Harperphobia, in the piece, didn't make the edit, but I think that's an apt term for it. People voted strategically, and so they wanted to, and it happened in a matter of weeks, and it happened in a huge sort of, for Canada at least, landslide way. So what you had in Justin Trudeau, to return to the premise of who he is, you have, he's something like John Kennedy. He was the first boy. He was born when his father was in power in 1971. By his own account, pretty much, he didn't really do a whole hell of a lot with his life up until entering politics in 2008. He did some charitable work. He comes from money. He traveled. He was a bouncer. He was a snowboard guy, a stoner. But he got a couple degrees from university, and he had an appetite for politics, and he had an amazing name. Obviously, it's like the Kennedy name in the Canadian context, and it turned out that he was not much like his father, politically speaking. I mean, policy-wise, you'd say we can come to that, but more or less, he's a liberal, open-minded kind of a dude. But in terms of his political skills, his father was very much an intellectual and very much a strategic kind of thinker and interested in policy. Trudeau, the younger, is a press the flesh kind of a guy, almost like a celebrity. And this was what Harper tried to run against him with, this idea that there was no substance to him and that he was just Justin, the haircut. Or in that boxing match that you referred to, they referred to him as a shiny pony. What Trudeau did was the Liberal Party, under the preening, and I mean preening, ridiculously bad leadership of another so-called intellectual named Michael Ignatieff, who people might have heard of. He was sort of a torture-justifying Harvard professor and sort of carpetbagger who moved back to Canada and promised that he would, stay in Canada for the rest of his life. Of course, he left after getting trounced. So in 2011, they went from the minority party to a rump of 34 seats, and Trudeau was one of those members, and in order to sort of turn things around for the Liberals, he staged a publicity stunt, like a Putin-esque kind of a thing, and he challenged the toughest conservative to a boxing match. And everybody thought...
For charity. For charity.
Yeah, for grazing cancer. It was just like money for cancer research. It was, it looked like a couple of middle-aged white dudes with some sort of male aggression issues to work out getting into a ring. But Trudeau understood that it had much bigger symbolic significance if he could physically beat the hell out of a conservative, and that's what he did, to everyone's amazement. He beat up this black belt in karate military guy.
The guy's name was Brass Knuckles or something,
Brass
right?
Knuckles Brazeau, and talk about the vanquishment. Brass Knuckles Brazeau has lost his seat in the Senate due to a scandal and is working at a strip club in Ottawa. And there's Justin Trudeau, in the House of Parliament as a prime minister, reversal of fortunes, so to speak.
There's a quality of Canadian politics that sounds like we could be talking about, this is a town in upstate New York. You're actually talking about.
But you got Trudeau's mother, Maggie Trudeau,
right,
who, was partying with the Rolling Stones and having affairs with Teddy Kennedy and Ryan O'Neal in the 70s. I mean, she was a tabloid sensation. Like, she was the pre-Diana Diana, like a kind of semi-royal figure. So it has elements of kind of small town to it, and Ottawa is definitely, it refers to itself as the world's largest small town. It definitely has that vibe to it. But, Canada, you, Sam, let's go talk about how you are proud of your ignorance about Canada, and how many subjects
I'm not,
do you
I'm
take
not
pride
proud
in ignorance
about it. I mean, I do have a flag that announces that we wave out in front of the know nothing about.
In another conversation, you likened Canadian politics. Now you said it to upstate town. You said Oregon, the state of Oregon. It's just a little more important than that. It does the same amount of trade with the United States as China, for example. You might remember that the World War II was fought alongside Canada. You might remember that Canada provided the moral conscience during the Vietnam War to enable hundreds of thousands of people to dodge the draft. And you might remember that Canada as well refused to participate in the Iraq War, almost uniquely. That there's a place that Canada has had in the world since the 1960s in Trudeau, the reign of Pierre Trudeau and a guy named Lester Pearson, that was at stake in this election. And Harper wanted nothing more than to destroy that idea of Canada, what he would call a myth of Canada. Canada as a unique moral actor on the world stage and not just the stooge of whichever regime is in power in the United States.
I have to say, I got that sense that I was not sort of really conscious of that notion of how Canadians identified themselves and how much the Harper Project was determined to change the way that Canadians thought about themselves.
That's what was at stake. That's absolutely it. It was the Rob Fordification of Canada. And you see it if you really want to dig down into it. If anybody listening in Toronto will understand what I'm referring to, that you can call it the 905 effect. Downtown Toronto has been traditionally a really important part of the liberal worldview, and I don't mean just in Canada, I mean in the world. And lots of things were begun there: multiculturalism, the idea of race-blind immigration policy, and how Toronto is this incredible polyglot now. But surrounding it are these white suburbs, and the 905 is the area code on the phone. And they inflicted a mayor like Rob Ford on that city.
Remind people who Rob Ford is, because I think
the crack-smoking fat buffoon who was who ridicule
Be more
of the
blunt.
world fell on Toronto and Canada as that moron, went off on his crack binges.
But he also, but in addition to being, it wasn't just about him going on crack binges and being like this party, this like frat boy. He had the politics to go along with it. I mean, this guy was
basically. He was proud. It was proudly.
This guy could have walked on and off of Fox and Friends without really having to do anything other than perhaps tuck in his shirt, right?
Right, and so what you see in that is the vanishing of something that I think that most Canadians, and I say most because obviously a significant number don't agree, because Stephen Harper wasn't elected by 3 people. He was getting 35-40% of the vote, but the majority of Canadians don't agree with. And so you had a political culture that was the majority was divided against itself. And Trudeau benefited, I think, with a final sort of realization that if this was perpetuated much longer, that something really deeply precious would be gone.
I mean, is that what has motivated him? Because like I've heard, in the brief references that we have made to this election, we had multiple callers who called in to both criticize my sort of assessment, I
got some notes about that too.
But also, to be fair to me, criticize the assessment of the people who had just criticized my assessment. And so each Canadian called in saying that the last Canadian didn't know what they were talking about.
Oh yeah,
but they all agreed that I didn't know what I was talking about. But tell me, the two things.
Let's stipulate that part that you don't.
I'm perfectly willing to stipulate. That's why I brought you on, because I wanted to bring in an expert. But the two things stick out for me. One is that people were talking about, something like, Trudeau, when it comes to sort of more like neoliberal economic notions and things like supposedly free trade, like we're seeing with the TPP, he's all on board for that. The sense I got from your piece is that to the extent that there was a driving, I guess, reason for his candidacy, in his mind, it was to protect the legacy that his father had built of Canada being like multicultural and providing that sort of conscience for the world, if only because they're standing right next to America saying like, hey guy, there's another way to do this.
Yeah, you don't have to invade Iraq. You don't have to bomb Syria and ISIL. Like, that's not the only solution. Syrian refugees,
or you can have universal health care.
Well, yeah, I mean, and there's that has a lot of texture to it as well. But like, just to stick with the idea of how the West relates to Islam and the Muslim world, it's the front page of every newspaper in this country. This Donald Trump, crypto-fascistically demonizing an entire religion. It is not a small difference to have the leader of your country, in Justin Trudeau, be saying not just the opposite, but the opposite, and plus some, saying not only do we disagree with you, we're going to bring 25,000 refugees immediately to our country, and we're going to continue to do that because we are a nation of immigrants, because we are a nation of multiplicities, because a Muslim Canadian is just the same as what Harper referred to as an old stock Canadian. This era, this age that we live in, this age of terror, if you want to call it that, the stakes couldn't be higher on these matters. My little girls are in 6th grade in their little local school, and there's some Muslim kids in their school, and they're assigned to write an essay about Islam by their teachers, and this is a predominantly white little town we're in, and they get this study material that is just ridiculously reductive and insane about Muslims. It's like all Muslim women wear hijabs, all Muslim men, make Muslim women behave this way and that, and it's just, it's like 1940s Mississippi with black people, and this is what's abroad in the land, and so yeah, there are things. My Canadian friends and colleagues, emailed me as I was reporting this story to demand that I get a more sophisticated answer on global warming and carbon capture, or alleviation of childhood poverty. These are things that there's lots of people engaged with, and I respect and admire it, but don't lose track of like the big picture here. That Stephen Harper, his vision of Canada did not include anything like the kind of understanding and respect for difference that Justin Trudeau represents.
And I guess, I mean, theoretically, right? I mean, I say this theoretically, that when you are, that fundamental difference is the basis for any type of progressive and forward-thinking policies, right? I mean, if like you
Yeah,
don't have that central sense of empathy, where
that's
you
it.
you appreciate the humanity of other people, there was, I think you wrote in
I
the
mean,
piece.
it's really big, Sam. I mean, I feel like, what an interesting point. Just to digress for a second to say this, because, Obama gets a lot of heat, and rightly so, and sometimes from you, and sometimes from, people on the left. But, just remember, like, some fundamental concepts here about difference and about, little schoolgirls and how their friends are told about their religion and how, society organizes itself. That's big, big stuff, I think.